Cecilia Voss had been selling bread since she was 9 years old. Not because she wanted to, because her father's hands shook too badly to hold a knife. Her younger brother needed medicine every month, and the landlord didn't care about any of that. He cared about rent. Every morning she rose before the village did, lit the oven, mixed the dough, carried the basket through muddy streets while other girls her age were still sleeping. She never complained. Complaining cost energy she didn't have. The village of Aldenmore knew her face the way they knew the cobblestones. Always there, always underfoot, never truly noticed. She was the baker's daughter, the quiet one, the one who smiled too politely when the merchant wives spoke over her head at market. She had learned early. People like her were not meant to take up space. Her father, Edmund, had once been a respected craftsman. Then the fever came. It stole his steadiness, his clients, and eventually his pride. He sat by the window now, watching the street, apologizing with his eyes every time Cecilia walked in tired. "You shouldn't have to carry this," he told her once. She had kissed his forehead and said nothing. Because what was there to say? She carried it. That was simply the truth. Her brother Thomas was 12 and clever, dangerously clever, the kind of boy who asked questions that embarrassed adults. She adored him. She worked for him. Every coin she saved went toward keeping him in school, keeping him fed, keeping that brightness in his eyes alive a little longer. She had no savings beyond that, no suitors, no prospects. What she had was a basket, an early alarm, and the particular exhaustion of someone who has never once been rescued. The other girls in Aldenmore married merchants' sons or farmers with decent land. They whispered about Cecilia sometimes. Not cruelly, just practically, the way people discuss a stray cat that refuses to leave the street. "Such a shame," they said. "She's pretty enough. But what man wants that burden?" Cecilia heard them. She straightened her spine and sold more bread. There was one small pleasure she allowed herself. Every evening after deliveries, she walked past the old Ashcroft estate at the edge of the village. Long abandoned, gates rusted shut, ivy swallowing the stone walls whole. She didn't know why she liked it. Maybe because it looked the way she felt. Still standing. Barely, but still standing. She would pause there for exactly 1 minute. Then she would go home, make supper, help Thomas with his lessons, and fall asleep before she finished her own thoughts. That was her life. Small, exhausting, entirely hers. She was not waiting to be saved. She had stopped expecting that a long time ago. The Aldenmore harvest gathering happened once a year. Everyone came, the merchants, the landowners, the priest. Especially the gossips. It was held in the town hall, long tables draped in gold cloth, candles lit even before dark, because the wealthy liked to perform their wealth early. Cecilia came because Edmund asked her to. "It'll be good for Thomas to see it," her father said. "Let the boy have one nice evening." She pressed her only decent dress and went. The moment she walked in, she felt it. That particular shift in a room when someone who doesn't belong enters it. Heads didn't turn dramatically. They just angled. A degree or two, enough. She found a seat near the back and kept Thomas close. For a while it was fine, then Lord Harwick stood up. Lord Harwick was 60, red-faced, and owned half the farmland surrounding Aldenmore. He was also the man her father had borrowed money from. 3 years ago, during the worst of the fever, when there was no other choice, Edmund had been paying it back, slowly, faithfully, every month without fail. Harwick cleared his throat and tapped his glass. "I want to address something," he said pleasantly, "since we're all gathered." Cecilia felt her stomach drop. He looked directly at her father's empty chair. Edmund had stayed home, too weak for the cold night air. And then his eyes found Cecilia. "The Voss account," he announced, "is now 3 months behind." The room went quiet in that horrible, interested way rooms do when someone else's suffering becomes entertainment. "That's not true," Cecilia said. Quietly, clearly, Harwick tilted his head. "Excuse me." She stood up, her chair scraped. Half the room flinched. "We paid," she said, "every month. I delivered the payments myself." Harwick smiled the smile of a man who has never once been contradicted in public and finds it amusing. "My records disagree." "Then your records are wrong." A murmur moved through the tables. Merchant wives leaned toward each other. The priest looked at the ceiling. Two of Harwick's sons, broad-bored, shifted in their seats and smirked. "Perhaps," Harwick said, his voice carrying easily now, enjoying itself. "You're confused, girl. It happens. Running a household is complicated when the head of that household is unable to manage. Unable to manage. 3 words, perfectly placed, absolutely deliberate." The entire room now understood he wasn't talking about money anymore. He was talking about her father. His illness, his diminishment. He was using Edmund Voss, a man too sick to be here, too proud to have asked for pity, as a punchline at a party. Cecilia's hands went cold. "My father," she said, very carefully, "has managed more dignity in 1 sick day than you've produced in 60 years of good health." The silence after that was different, sharper. Harwick's smile thinned. "You owe me 4 months now," he said. "Consider this your public notice. If the debt is not cleared in full within 30 days, I will pursue the cottage." The oven, all of it. She heard Thomas shift beside her. She did not look at him. If she looked at him, she would break. "I'll see it paid," she said. "See that you do." Harwick sat down, reached for his wine, and resumed his conversation as if she had already ceased to exist. No one at the surrounding tables said anything. One woman, Helena Marsh, whose dress cost more than Cecilia's monthly earnings, actually laughed softly at something her husband whispered. Cecilia sat back down. She picked up her cup, set it down, picked it up again. Thomas slipped his hand under the table and found hers, squeezed once, said nothing. He was 12 years old, and he already knew when his sister needed silence instead of comfort. She held his hand tight and stared straight ahead while the party continued around them. Later, walking home in the cold, Thomas spoke first. "We don't have 4 months of payments," he said. "No. What are we going to do?" She looked up at the sky. Stars. Frost starting to crust the road beneath them. Somewhere across the village, behind its rusted gates, the Ashcroft estate sat dark and still. "I don't know yet," she said. It was the most honest thing she had said all evening. She did not sleep that night. She lay in the dark and did the arithmetic over and over, searching for a number that wasn't there. Every arrangement collapsed. Every calculation came up short. By morning, she had accepted something she had been refusing to accept for months. There was no path out of this alone. She just didn't know yet that a path was already walking toward her. She saw him first at the well, a man she didn't recognize, and in Aldenmore, you recognized everyone. He was drawing water with the focused efficiency of someone who had done hard labor all his life, plain coat, worn boots, dark hair pushed back carelessly, not remarkable, not at first. But his hands were wrong for a laborer. Too steady, too deliberate. The kind of steady that didn't come from work. It came from control, she noticed, filed it away, kept walking. His name, she learned by noon, was Alexander. He had apparently arrived 3 days ago and taken a position at Edmund Farley's stable on the East Road, mucking stalls, feeding horses, the lowest rung of work available in the village. People were already talking about him the way villages talk about anyone new, with curiosity poorly disguised as indifference. "Strange man," the butcher's wife told her at market. "Doesn't talk much, pays for everything in cash." Who carries that much cash to a stable job? Cecilia bought her flour and said nothing. He came to her bread stall that afternoon. She almost missed him. She was wrapping a loaf for old Mrs. Crane when she looked up, and he was simply there, standing slightly apart from the small queue, watching her work. Not watching her. Exactly, watching her work. There was a difference. She had spent enough years being looked through to recognize when someone was actually paying attention. It unsettled her more than being ignored. When his turn came, he bought a single loaf, paid without haggling, started to leave, then stopped. "I heard what happened at the harvest gathering," he said. She went still. "Most people did. Harwick's claim is false." She looked at him properly for the first time. "You weren't there." "No," he agreed, "but I know what kind of man makes announcements like that in public." He wasn't collecting a debt. He was collecting an audience. A beat of silence. He was right. That was the most irritating part. "I don't know you," she said carefully. "Alexander," he said, "I work at Farley's stable. I know who you are." She wiped her hands on her apron. "What I don't know is why Harwick's business is yours." He considered that. "Then I have a proposal." Her hands stopped moving. Something in his voice had shifted. Not dramatically, but the way a river shifts. The surface looks the same, but suddenly you can feel the depth beneath it. "I need a wife," he said. "Specifically, I need someone who can run a household under pressure, who doesn't collapse in public, and who has enough spine to speak plainly when it's necessary." A pause. "You have all three." The market noise continued around them. Carts, voices, a dog barking somewhere. Cecilia stared at him. "You've watched me for one afternoon," she said. 3 days, he corrected. "I arrived Tuesday. That's worse." The corner of his mouth moved. Almost a smile, quickly controlled. "I can clear Harwick's debt," he said. "Completely. I can also ensure your father and brother are taken care of, properly, not temporarily. In exchange, I'm asking for a legal marriage and 6 months of your time." 6 months. After that, you'd be free to leave, with enough money that you'd never have to sell bread again unless you wanted to. She laughed. Short, disbelieving. "You're a stableman." "Yes. Where does a stableman get the money to clear Harwick's debts and support a family?" "That's a fair question. Answer it." He looked at her directly. His eyes were calm in a way that was frankly unnerving. Not the calm of someone who had nothing going on, but the calm of someone who had decided exactly how much he was going to reveal. "Not yet," he said. "Not yet. 2 words. Quiet. Absolute." Cecilia felt the hairs on her arms rise, not from fear exactly. From the recognition that something very large was standing in front of her in ordinary clothes. "That's not how proposals work," she said. "Most proposals don't involve clearing debts and guaranteeing a family's survival," he replied. "I think the terms balance." She should have said no. Every sensible instinct she possessed was pointing the same direction. Stranger, secrets, danger. No, she had trusted her instincts her whole life. They had kept her family alive through years of difficulty, and yet 30 days, 4 months of payments. A debt she had no way to clear, Thomas's school fees, her father's medicine. The oven Harwick had threatened to take. The mathematics had not changed overnight. "I need 3 days, she said finally. He nodded once. No argument, no pressure. That, perversely, worried her more than anything he'd said. A desperate man pushes. A confident man waits. She watched him walk away through the market crowd. Unhurried, unremarkable, boots worn down at the heel, and felt the absolute certainty that she was not seeing the whole picture. The question was, how much of the picture was hidden, and what was underneath it? She said yes on the 3rd day. Not because she had stopped being afraid, because she had done the arithmetic one final time and arrived at the same answer she always did. There was no other way. She told Thomas first. He listened without interrupting, which meant he was either very calm or very alarmed. With Thomas, those looked identical. "Do you trust him?" he asked. No, she said honestly. Not yet, but you're doing it anyway. Yes. Thomas was quiet for a moment, then, I'll watch him. She almost smiled. 12 years old and already standing guard. I know you will. Her father said nothing when she told him, just reached out and held her hand for a long time. That was worse than words. The wedding was small. The priest, 2 witnesses. A grey Tuesday morning that smelled like coming rain. Alexander stood at the altar in a slightly better coat than usual. Still plain, still quietly wrong, somehow like a man wearing a costume of himself. He spoke his vows clearly, without flourish, and slid a ring onto her finger that she didn't examine until afterward. Simple band, old gold. The kind of old that meant generations, not affordable. She filed that away. They moved into a cottage on the edge of the village, rented, modest, 3 rooms. Cecilia had expected that. What she hadn't expected was how quickly and completely Harwick's debt disappeared. Not paid off gradually. Gone. She found out the morning after the wedding, when a clerk from Harwick's estate appeared at her father's door, looking deeply uncomfortable, and handed Edmund a letter, debt settled in full, no further obligation. Her father read it twice, then looked up at her with an expression she hadn't seen on his face in years. Relief. Pure, uncomplicated relief. She brought the letter home and set it in front of Alexander at breakfast. How? She asked. He looked at the letter, then at her. I paid it. With what? He set down his cup. Cecilia, that's not an answer. A beat. Then he stood, moved to the small chest near the door. She had noticed it when they arrived, heavy, always locked, and opened it. She looked inside. Then she looked at him. Then she looked inside again. It wasn't an outrageous fortune. It wasn't chests of gold coins and jewels. It was something somehow more alarming than that. Organized documents, folded letters with wax seals she didn't recognize, and a leather purse that, when he handed it to her and she felt the weight, contained more money than she had earned in the last 4 years combined. You're not a stableman, she said. I worked in the stable, he said. That part was true. Alexander. He sat back down, looked at the table for a moment, then, my family owns land, he said. Significant land. I came to Aldenmore privately, without announcement. I had reasons for that, reasons I'm not ready to explain fully, not yet. He met her eyes. What I can tell you is that you and your family will never be in Harwick's position again. That's not a promise. That's already done. She sat across from him and studied his face. He wasn't lying, she was almost certain of that. But the way he spoke, carefully, precisely, giving her enough to satisfy the immediate question without opening any of the doors behind it, told her that what he'd revealed was a fraction. A man with significant land didn't work in a stable. A man with that kind of money didn't need a wife from a bread stall. Why me? She asked, genuinely. With what you have, why me? He was quiet long enough that she thought Yost he might not answer. Because you stood up in that room, he said finally, when every person with more power and more comfort stayed seated. You stood up for a man who wasn't even there to see it. A pause. I needed to know if that was who you were or just who you were that night. And it's who you are, he said simply. I watched for 3 days. It's entirely who you are. She didn't know what to do with that. So she did what she always did when something threatened to overwhelm her. She stood up, cleared the cups, and moved back into the rhythm of the morning. But her hands were not entirely steady. The village found out within a week. Not the full truth. Nobody knew the full truth yet, including Cecilia. But word traveled that the stableman had money, that Harwick's debt had vanished overnight, that Cecilia Voss, the bread girl, the burden, had somehow landed on her feet. The reactions were immediate and deeply predictable. Confusion, recalculation, A few generous servings of retrospective kindness from people who had watched Harwick humiliate her without a word. Helena Marsh stopped her on the road and smiled warmly. "You look well, Cecilia. Marriage suits you." Cecilia smiled back with every muscle in her face and none of her eyes. "Thank you, Helena." She kept walking. That night she lay awake and thought about the sealed letters in the chest. The wax crests she didn't recognize. The ring that was too old for a man of modest means. The way he said significant land, the way other men said a small plot. He had given her reveal number 1. She could feel with absolute certainty that she was nowhere near the end of the story. 3 weeks into the marriage, Alexander stopped going to the stable. No explanation, he simply didn't go one morning. Then the next. By the 4th day it was clear that chapter was closed. What replaced it was harder to define. Men came to the cottage. Not village men, not farmers or merchants. Men who arrived on good horses, dressed plainly but expensively, who spoke to Alexander in low voices and left quickly. Sometimes they brought documents. Sometimes they left with them. Cecilia served tea when it was appropriate and asked nothing. She was watching. What changed first was the small things. A larger cottage appeared, not offered, simply arranged. One morning Alexander told her they were moving, and by afternoon 2 men she'd never seen were transferring their belongings to a stone house on the hill road, with 4 rooms, a proper kitchen, and a garden that someone had clearly been maintaining in anticipation. In anticipation, she stood in the kitchen and ran her hand along the counter. "Good stone, solid." "Old. Did you already own this?" she asked when Alexander appeared in the doorway. "Yes," he said, "before you came to Aldenmore." "Yes." She nodded slowly. Filed it away with everything else. Thomas visited every afternoon and pretended he wasn't cataloguing every detail of the house. He asked Alexander careful, intelligent questions disguised as casual conversation. Alexander answered them directly, briefly, without condescension, which earned him more of Thomas's trust than any gift could have. Cecilia noticed this. She noticed everything. Her father's health improved with the medicine now arriving regularly, properly sourced, without the compromises she'd been forced to make on cost. Edmund had color in his face again. He sat at a real table now instead of by a drafty window. These things should have made her relax. They didn't, because comfort, she had learned, was not the same as safety, and a life that improved this quickly, this smoothly, was a life that hadn't shown her its full shape yet. She and Alexander existed in the house with a careful, functional politeness. He was not cold. He was contained. He asked about her day and meant it. He remembered details she mentioned once and never repeated. He did not crowd her or demand warmth she hadn't offered. She found this simultaneously easier and more unsettling than hostility would have been. One evening she came downstairs late and found him at the desk, reading by candlelight, 3 letters open in front of him, his jaw set in a way she hadn't seen before. She stopped in the doorway. He looked up. The tension in his face didn't disappear. He simply chose not to hide it, which felt like a form of respect. "Bad news?" she asked. He considered the question seriously. "Complicated news," he said. She crossed the room and sat in the chair across from him. Not pushing, just present. After a moment he folded the letters and set them aside. "You don't ask me questions," he said. "Most people would." "I ask questions when I think you'll answer them," she said. "The rest I watch for." Something moved in his expression. "Quickly gone. What have you watched so far?" "A man who is very careful about what he shows," she said. "Who has more responsibilities than a stable job explains. Who chose this village specifically, not randomly, specifically, and who is waiting for something." A pause. "I don't know what yet." He looked at her for a long moment. "You're not what I expected," he said quietly. "What did you expect?" someone who'd be satisfied with the comfort. He glanced at the house around them. The good walls, the warm fire, the stability she hadn't known in years. Most people stop asking questions when the immediate problem is solved. My immediate problem was never really about money, she said. No, he agreed, it wasn't. They sat in silence for a moment that was, for the first time, not entirely careful. Something slightly more honest lived in it. Then he picked up one of the folded letters and held it for a moment. There are people, he said slowly, who are not pleased about my presence here, about certain decisions I've made, about what those decisions mean for them. She kept her face neutral. People with resources. Yes. Are we in danger? He met her eyes directly. Not yet, he said, but the situation is moving. She looked at the letter in his hand. The broken wax seal on the desk she could now see clearly. A crest. An elaborate one. The kind that didn't belong to landowners. The kind that belonged to something older than that. She didn't ask. Not tonight. But she understood something clearly for the first time. The mansion, the money, the comfort, none of it was the point. She had walked into something that had been in motion long before she arrived, and it was accelerating. It started with a fire, small, contained. The garden shed behind the stone house burned cleanly to the foundations sometime between midnight and dawn. No accident. The smell was wrong. Too even. Too deliberate. Alexander was already outside when Cecilia came downstairs. Standing in the grey morning light, looking at the ash. His face completely still. That stillness frightened her more than the fire. Who did this? She asked. He didn't answer immediately. Alexander. The Velmore faction, he said quietly. She waited. He turned from the ash and looked at her, and for the first time since she'd met him, the careful composure slipped slightly, not into fear, into something heavier than that. Exhaustion. Come inside, he said. I'll tell you what I can. What he told her was this. He was not simply a man with significant land. The Ashcroft name, his name, was tied to a territorial claim that had been dormant for 11 years. A contested inheritance involving 3 counties. Mineral rights worth more than most men would see in 10 lifetimes. And a legal succession that certain powerful families had spent considerable money trying to prevent from ever being resolved. The Velmore family was chief among them. They assumed I'd stay buried, he said, that I'd take the money I had access to and disappear quietly, build a comfortable life somewhere small and leave the claim alone. But you didn't, no. Why Aldenmore? She asked specifically. He was quiet for a moment. The original Ashcroft estate, he said, the one at the edge of the village. She went still. The rusted gates, the ivy-covered walls, the place she had walked past every evening for years. That's yours, she said. It's been locked in legal dispute for over a decade, he said. But yes, it belongs to my family. It was the seat of the Ashcroft line before the claim was challenged. He paused. I came back to finish it. The room was very quiet. Cecilia sat with this information and let it settle. All those evenings, the rusted gates, the feeling she couldn't explain, that battered, still-standing quality that had always made her stop and look. She had been walking past his inheritance every night, without knowing it. The stable job, she said slowly. I needed to move through the village without announcement, assess the situation, determine who was watching. His jaw tightened. The Velmore network extends further than most people realize. If I'd arrived as Alexander Ashcroft, whatever remains of their local contacts would have reported it before I'd unpacked. So, you came as a stableman. It's not the first time I've done something like that. She looked at him carefully. Who are you? Fully. What does the Ashcroft name actually mean? A long pause. My father was the Duke of Ashcroft, he said. The title has been in legal suspension since his death. If the territorial claim resolves the way I believe it will." He stopped. "You become the Duke," she said. He didn't confirm it immediately. He didn't need to. The wax crests, the men on good horses, the organized documents, the ring too old for ordinary money. Everything she had filed away now snapped into a single shape. She stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the village of Aldenmore continued its morning. Bread carts, children, the ordinary machinery of ordinary life. She had sold bread in this village for years. She had been publicly humiliated in this village. She had walked past his rusted gates every evening thinking about endurance. And she had somehow married the man at the center of a decade-long power conflict she knew nothing about. "The Velmors," she said, still looking out the window. "What do they want specifically?" "The claim to fail," he said, "or to be abandoned, or—" A pause. "For me to not be in a position to press it." She turned. "That's a threat against your life." "It's been a threat for 11 years, he said, without drama. "I've managed it. You managed it alone." "Yes." She studied him. The exhaustion she'd glimpsed earlier was still there. Not weakness, but the specific weight of someone who had been vigilant for so long they'd forgotten what it felt like not to be. Something shifted in her chest. Not sympathy, something more complicated than that. "The fire was a message," she said. "Yes, telling you they know you're here. Yes, and that they're willing to escalate." He looked at her steadily. "Yes." She nodded once, turned back to the window. The rusted gates of the Ashcroft estate were just visible at the far edge of the road. Ancient stone, overgrown, waiting. "Then we don't give them the satisfaction of watching us flinch," she said quietly. Silence. Then, behind her, something she hadn't heard from him before. Not quite a laugh, but close. "We," she turned, met his eyes. "You said we don't give them the satisfaction." She held his gaze. "I noticed." She started with the documents, not because Alexander asked her to, because she sat across from him. One evening while he worked through a stack of legal correspondence and watched him miss something. Small thing. A date discrepancy in a land registry letter. The kind of detail that disappeared inside dense legal language, unless you were the sort of person who had spent years checking every number twice because mistakes cost money you didn't have. She was exactly that sort of person. "This date is wrong," she said. Pointing, he looked up. "The registry letter says the Velmore counterclaim was filed the 14th, but this response letter references the 16th as the filing date." She set them side by side. If their own correspondence contradicts the filing date, that's grounds to challenge the counterclaim's validity. Alexander stared at the two letters, then at her. "I've read those 4 times, he said. "You were reading for content," she said. "I read for errors." That was the beginning. Within 2 weeks she had organized his entire document system. 11 years of scattered correspondence, legal filings, land surveys, and contested records into something that could actually be navigated. She created a timeline, cross-referenced names, built a map of the Velmore network from nothing but letters and dates, and the patterns she found connecting them. Alexander's solicitor, a thin, precise man named Mr. Graves, who traveled from the city every fortnight, arrived for his regular visit and stopped dead in the doorway of the study. "What happened in here?" he said. "My wife," Alexander said. Graves looked at the organized files, the color-coded timeline pinned to the wall, the indexed correspondence. He looked at Cecilia. "Can you come to every meeting?" he asked. But it wasn't only the documents. The Velmores had local contacts. She had understood that from the beginning. What became clear as she moved through the village was that she was better positioned to identify them than Alexander was. She had sold bread to these people for years. She knew who owed Harwick favors, who drank with the Velmore estate manager when he visited, who asked questions that were slightly too specific about Alexander's movements, disguised as friendly conversation. She started mapping it, quietly, without announcement. One afternoon she came home and sat across from Alexander. "Margaret Holt," she said. He looked up from his work. "She asked me 3 times this week about your schedule." Framed differently each time, but the same question. She reports to someone. Cecilia paused. She also owes Harwick money, which means Harwick may be more connected to the Velmore network than you've assumed. Alexander set down his pen. "You got all of that from a conversation." "I got all of that from 3 conversations," she corrected, "with a woman who underestimated me, because people like her always underestimate women carrying bread baskets. A beat. Then, what do you recommend?" The question landed differently than she expected. Not "what do you think?" or "that's interesting." "What do you recommend?" The word of a man consulting an equal. She had not been spoken to that way before. She kept her face steady. "We feed her false information, carefully. We let her report something to the Velmores that leads them in the wrong direction, while you accelerate the real claim process." He looked at her for a long moment. "That's exactly right," he said quietly. She did not become powerful dramatically. There was no single moment, no transformation scene. It was quieter, and more thorough than that. A woman discovering that the skills she'd spent years using to survive could also be used to fight. Her endurance became strategy. Her invisibility became intelligence. Her habit of reading every situation carefully before speaking became something that made Graves nervous in meetings, because she consistently identified problems before he did. Thomas visited one afternoon and found her at the desk, cross-referencing 2 land surveys. He stood in the doorway and looked at the room, the documents, the timeline, the methodical order of it all. "You look different," he said. "Do I? You look like you're in charge of something." She glanced around the room, at the work that had slowly, undeniably become hers. "I think I am," she said. Alexander noticed too. She could see it in the way he spoke to her. Now less careful, less measured, more direct. The composure he wore like armor loosened slightly in her presence, the way it loosens around someone you've decided to trust, before you've fully admitted it to yourself. One evening after Graves had left, and the documents were put away, he sat across from her and said, "I came to Aldenmore to resolve a legal claim alone. That was the plan." She waited. "I don't think I can do this without you anymore," he said. "I want to be honest about that." It was the most unguarded thing he had said to her. She considered it seriously, the way it deserved. "You could," she said finally, "but it would take longer and you'd miss things." His mouth curved, genuine this time, no controlling it. "Yes," he said, "I would." She had arrived in his world as a transaction. She was no longer that. She wasn't sure exactly what she was becoming, but for the first time in her life, the shape of it felt entirely like her own. The letter arrived on a Wednesday, heavy paper, black wax seal, the crest she now recognized, not the Ashcroft mark, something older, something above it. Alexander read it standing in the hallway, didn't move for a long moment. Then he folded it carefully, put it in his coat, and said, "I need to tell you something." They sat in the study. He placed the letter on the desk between them, but didn't open it again. He already knew what it said. He was deciding, she realized, not what to tell her, but how much he'd been wrong to withhold. "The Ashcroft dukedom," he began. "I told you my father held it." "Yes." "What I didn't tell you," he stopped, recalibrated. "My father was the Duke of Ashcroft, but his title was itself a subordinate title." She went still. "Subordinate to what?" she asked. "To the sovereign dominion of Castanmere," he said, "which is not a dukedom, it's not a lordship." A pause. "It's a sovereign territory, semi-autonomous. older than the current kingdom's boundary lines. It has its own charter, its own legal jurisdiction, and its own seat. The room was very quiet. "Alexander," she said carefully, "what are you telling me?" He met her eyes. "My grandfather was the sovereign lord of Castanmere. The territory passed to my father. My father died before the succession was formally transferred, which is what the Velmors exploited. They challenged the Ashcroft dukedom specifically because collapsing that title would sever my legal standing to claim Castanmere." He paused. The dukedom was never the prize, it was the key. Cecilia sat with this. She looked at the letter. "What does that say?" she asked. "The Castanmere Council of Seat," he said. "They've been monitoring the legal proceedings. The original council, the governing body of the territory, never recognized the Velmor challenge as legitimate. They've been waiting for me to press the claim formally." He opened the letter and turned it toward her. "They're asking me to come, to present before the full council, to take the seat." She read it. The language was formal, ancient almost, the kind of prose that carried centuries in its structure. But the meaning was clear. They were summoning him home, not as a claimant, as the sovereign lord of Castanmere. She stood up and walked to the window. Outside, Aldenmoor, the market road, the bread stalls, the well where she had first seen him drawing water in worn boots. She thought about the rusted gates, the abandoned estate, a man spending 3 days watching a woman sell bread before he approached her. "You knew all of this when you came here," she said. "Yes. When you proposed to me, yes." She turned. "And you didn't tell me?" "No." He didn't flinch from it. "I told you I had reasons I wasn't ready to explain. That was true. But," he paused, "I also didn't know, at that point, whether the council would move, whether the claim would advance. I didn't want to tell you what I might not be able to deliver. Or," she said quietly, "you didn't know if you could trust me with it." A beat. "That too," he admitted. She respected the honesty. It didn't fully dissolve the sting. "What happens," she said, "if you take the seat? The Velmor challenge collapses entirely. The Ashcroft estate is restored. The Castanmere territory comes under active governance for the first time in 11 years. He paused. "And I stop running a legal battle from a stone cottage in a village. And what happens to me?" The question landed in the room and sat there. He looked at her directly. "That depends on what you want," he said. "I told you 6 months. Freedom to leave afterward. That offer stands. It will always stand." A pause. "But if you stayed," he stopped. "Say it," she said. "If you stayed," he said carefully, "you would not be the wife of a man with significant land. You would be the sovereign lady of Castanmere." The silence after that was enormous. She didn't answer that night. She went to bed and lay in the dark and thought about a girl who rose before dawn to light an oven, who carried bread through mud, who stood up in a room full of people who stayed seated. She thought about what that girl had wanted. Not wealth, not a title. To not be invisible anymore. To matter somewhere. To someone. She thought about Alexander's face when she'd found the date discrepancy. The way Graves had looked at her. Thomas saying, "You look like you're in charge of something." She thought about the rusted gates. Still standing, barely, but still standing. Then she thought about them open. In the morning she came downstairs. Alexander was at the desk. He looked up, carefully, giving nothing away. Waiting. "When do we leave for Castanmere?" she said. Something crossed his face. Fast, unguarded. The closest thing to relief she had ever seen on him. 3 days, he said. She nodded, reached past him for the document stack. "Then we have work to do," she said. They left for Castanmere on a Thursday morning. Cecilia told her father the night before. Not everything, enough. Edmund listened quietly, then held her hand the same way he had when she'd told him about the marriage. Long, wordless, saying everything, Thomas, she told everything. He sat with it for a full minute. Then I knew he wasn't a stableman. She laughed, the first real laugh in weeks. No, you didn't. I suspected, he said firmly. She hugged him tighter than she intended. The journey to Castonmere took 2 days. As they traveled, the landscape changed. Wider roads, older trees, stone walls that had been standing for centuries. Cecilia watched it through the carriage window and felt the weight of it. History embedded in geography. A territory that remembered itself even when its lord had been absent. Alexander traveled quietly, watchful. The closer they got, the more focused he became, shedding the last traces of the cottage, the stable, the village, becoming something else. Someone she recognized but hadn't fully seen yet. She found she wasn't afraid of that version of him. She was curious about it. Castonmere itself was not what she expected. Not a castle exactly, something older. A great house built in stages across different centuries, each addition slightly different from the last, creating a structure that felt like a conversation between eras. It sat on elevated ground above a valley, and when they crested the final hill, and she saw it for the first time, she understood the rusted gates. This was what they were the shadow of. Mr. Graves was already there. 2 council members arrived the following morning. Preparations began. Cecilia worked. She reviewed the succession documents one final time, organized Alexander's presentation for the council, identified 3 remaining vulnerabilities in the legal filing that Graves had missed. He now stopped pretending to be surprised when she did this. The council session was scheduled for the 3rd day. On the 2nd night, she couldn't sleep. She walked the long corridor outside their rooms and found a window overlooking the valley below, stood there in the quiet. Footsteps behind her. She turned, expecting Alexander. It was Mr. Graves. She liked Graves. He was precise, honest, occasionally brusque in the way of men who respect efficiency over comfort. She had trusted him. He stopped a few feet away. "You should know something," he said. His voice was different, the precision still there, but the honesty gone from beneath it. Something cold moved through her. "The Velmore family," he said quietly. "They approached me 6 weeks ago." She said nothing, waited. "They offered a settlement, a significant one. In exchange for," he paused, "in exchange for ensuring the council presentation contained enough procedural irregularities to allow the challenge to stand." The valley below was dark and silent. "You've been working against him," she said. "I've been navigating an impossible situation," Graves said, with the conviction of a man who had rehearsed this framing. "Alexander is walking into a proceeding he doesn't fully control. The Velmores have council contacts. At least 2 members are compromised. The claim was never going to succeed cleanly. I was trying to engineer a controlled outcome, a partial settlement that preserved." "Stop," she said. He stopped. She looked at him carefully. "You found irregularities in those filings," she said. "Did you put them there?" A pause, 1 beat too long. "Some of them," he said quietly. She went back to her room. Did not go to Alexander immediately. She needed 60 seconds to be furious in private before she could be useful. 60 seconds exactly. Then she went and knocked on his door. He opened it, took one look at her face. "What happened?" he said. She told him, cleanly, completely, no softening. She watched the information move through him. The stillness first, then something beneath it. Not rage exactly, deeper than rage. The particular devastation of a betrayal from someone you relied on. Graves had been with him for 4 years. Alexander sat down. She gave him 30 seconds then. "We can fix this," she said. He looked up. "The irregularities he introduced, I flagged 3 of them already without knowing what they were. I assumed they were errors." She sat across from him. "Now that I know they're deliberate, I can identify all of them. Tonight, We rebuild the filing from the corrected documents. We arrive at that council session tomorrow with something Graves never gave you." "What's that?" he said. "A clean case," she said. "One that doesn't need him." He looked at her for a long moment. Outside, the valley, the dark. The weight of 11 years pressing against tomorrow morning. "You'd have to work through the night," he said. She was already standing. "I know," she said. She worked through the night, every document, every filing, every date, reference, and cross-sortation rebuilt from the ground up, hunting Graves' interference the way she hunted arithmetic errors in ledger books. Methodically, without sentiment, Alexander worked beside her. Neither of them spoke much. They didn't need to. There was a rhythm to it. She identified, he confirmed. They corrected. The candles burned low and were replaced. Somewhere around 2 in the morning, she found the deepest irregularity. A jurisdictional reference, Graves, had quietly altered. 3 words changed in a subordinate clause that would have invalidated the succession timeline entirely. She stared at it. 3 words. 11 years of Alexander's fight. 3 words from a trusted man. She crossed them out, wrote the correction, moved on. By dawn, they had something clean. Not perfect. There wasn't time for perfect, but honest. Solid. A case built on what was actually true, rather than what had been quietly shaped to fail. Alexander looked at the final stack of documents, then at her. She looked like what she was, a woman who had not slept, working by the last of the candlelight, ink on her fingers, hair pulled back severely. "This is better than anything Graves produced in 4 years," he said quietly. "Graves wasn't trying to win," she said. She handed him the stack. He took it. Their fingers overlapped for a moment on the documents. Neither of them moved immediately. Then the morning bell from the valley below broke the silence, and they both straightened. Work to do. The council convened at 10. 7 members. A long table in the oldest part of the house. Stone walls. High windows. The kind of room that had absorbed centuries of decisions and showed it. Cecilia sat to Alexander's left. No one had told her to sit there. No one had told her not to. She sat there. 2 of the council members. She had identified them from Graves' description, cross-referenced against names in the correspondence, watched Alexander's entrance with expressions too neutral to be neutral. Compromised, both of them. She marked their faces and kept her own still. The session began well. Alexander presented cleanly. The succession timeline held. The documentation was precise. Cecilia watched the council members, the honest ones engaged, leaned forward, asked genuine questions. Then the first compromised member spoke, Lord Penwick. 60, deliberate, the kind of man who disguised attacks as procedural concerns. "The Velmore counterclaim," he said pleasantly, "raises a specific question about the transfer date. The record as presented shows the 14th. However, he produced a document. We have a filing in our own records showing the 16th. Cecilia recognized it instantly. The same discrepancy she had found weeks ago in Alexander's correspondence. But Penwick's version, she could see from here, the paperweight was different, newer, was not the original. It was a fabrication. Her stomach dropped. Not because she was surprised, because she understood what it meant. Graves hadn't just introduced irregularities into Alexander's filing. He had provided the Velmores with manufactured evidence to present from the council's own records, a document that appeared to come from inside the council itself. They hadn't been outmaneuvered on the filing. They'd been set up for exactly this moment, Alexander answered calmly, presented the corrected timeline, pointed to the cross-references. Penwick smiled in the way of a man holding a card he hasn't played yet. The second compromised member, younger, quieter, then raised a procedural challenge to the succession charter itself. Technical, dense. the kind of objection that required specific legal precedent to counter. Graves would have had that precedent prepared. Graves was not here. Cecilia saw it in Alexander's face. The fraction of a second where he reached for something that wasn't there. A gap where 4 years of preparation should have been. The room felt it. One of the honest council members shifted uncomfortably. Penwick's expression didn't change, but his posture settled. The way a man settles when he believes he's already won. A recess was called. 30 minutes. They stepped into a side room, and Alexander closed the door. He stood with his back to her for a moment, her hands flat on the table. She waited. "The charter precedent," he said. "Graves handled that entire section. I don't have it memorized, and it's not in what we rebuilt last night. I didn't know we needed it." "I know," she said. "Without it, Penwick's procedural challenge stands. It pauses the entire proceeding, possibly indefinitely." He turned. His face was controlled, but she could see what was underneath it now. The weight of 11 years, the betrayal, the gap that had appeared at exactly the worst moment. "Everything we did last night," he said quietly. "It may not be enough." The valley outside the window, the ancient walls, the seat of something that had waited 11 years for this morning. Cecilia sat down, closed her eyes for 5 seconds, opened them. "The charter document," she said. "Is there a copy in this house?" He stared at her. "There should be," he said slowly. "The archive, but it hasn't been accessed in years. I don't know what condition." She was already standing. "We have 28 minutes, she said. The archive was at the back of the house, a room that smelled of cold stone and decades. Shelves floor to ceiling, documents in leather casings, everything organized by a system that hadn't been touched since Alexander's father died. 28 minutes. She didn't panic. Panic was a luxury. She moved to the shelves and read the casings, dates, categories, territorial references, her eyes moving fast, her hands faster. Alexander worked the opposite wall. Neither of them spoke. 17 minutes. She found the charter section at the back of the third shelf, pulled the casing. The documents were old, genuinely old, the paper fragile at the edges, the ink faded but legible. She scanned fast, turned pages carefully, then stopped. "Alexander." He crossed the room. She pointed. It wasn't just the charter precedent. What she had found was the original Castanmere Sovereignty Charter. Not a copy, not a reference document. The founding charter, dated 340 years ago, bearing the original sovereign seal, and beneath it, folded separately, something she hadn't expected, a letter. His father's handwriting. She recognized it from the documents she'd organized, addressed to no one, or to whoever found it. Alexander went very still. "Read it later," she said gently. "We have 12 minutes." He folded it carefully and put it inside his coat. She took the charter. They returned to the council room with 4 minutes to spare. Cecilia set the charter on the table in front of her, not in front of Alexander, in front of herself. Penwick noticed. His expression flickered. When the session resumed, the younger compromised member moved to press the procedural challenge immediately. Clearly, the plan was to establish it, before Alexander could respond. "The charter precedent," he began, "as I was explaining, requires the original sovereignty document," Cecilia said. The room turned to her. She was not a council member. She had not been formally introduced in any legal capacity. She held that gaze and didn't move. The eldest council member, Lord Harron, 80 if he was a day, who had said almost nothing, leaned forward slightly. "Who are you?" he asked, not rudely, with genuine attention. "Cecilia Ashcroft," she said, the name still new in her mouth. She said it clearly, "and I believe what you need is in front of me." She opened the charter and turned it to face the council. The room changed, not dramatically, a shift like a tide turning, subtle but absolute. Lord Harren rose slowly from his chair and crossed to the table, looked at the document for a long moment, his hands, spotted, careful, moved to the seal. He looked up at Penwick. "This is the founding charter," Harren said. "The original." A pause. "Do you know what this means for your procedural challenge, Penwick?" Penwick's composure held, but something behind it didn't. It means, Harren continued, not waiting for an answer, that the sovereignty of Castanmere predates every legal instrument the Velmore family has cited. Every challenge, every counter-claim. He straightened. It means the challenge had no legitimate standing from the beginning. The second compromised member started to speak. "Don't," Harren said quietly. He didn't. Then Cecilia placed the second document on the table. Not the father's letter. That was private. Something else she'd found beneath the charter casing. A succession instrument signed by Alexander's father and witnessed, predating the Velmore challenge by 3 years. Filed, and here was the devastating part, filed directly with the Castanmere Council archive, not through graves, not through any channel the Velmores could have touched. It had been sitting in this house the whole time, waiting. Harren read it, then read it again. Then he looked at Alexander with an expression that contained something ancient and tired, and finally resolved. "Your father knew," Harren said quietly. "He filed this here specifically, in case the external proceedings were compromised. He set the document down. He trusted the house to hold it." Alexander said nothing. Cecilia watched his face, controlled as always. But his jaw moved once, just once. She looked away, gave him that. The vote took 11 minutes, 5-2. Penwick and the younger member voted against. Everyone in the room understood what that meant. Harren announced he would be referring both names for investigation before the session was even formally closed. They didn't look at each other. Afterward, in the corridor, Alexander stopped walking. She stopped beside him. The house was quiet around them. Centuries of it, all that waiting, suddenly finished. He reached into his coat and looked at his father's letter for a moment without opening it. Then he looked at her. "You found it," he said. "We had 12 minutes," she said. "I work well under pressure." He looked at her, really looked, the way he had at the bread stall when he was watching her work, but different now. Fuller. "I wouldn't have done this without you," he said. "I know," she said. Not arrogance, just truth. He almost smiled. "You're not going to make this modest, are you?" "No," she said simply. And this time he did smile. Fully, unguarded. She decided. She liked it enormously. They returned to Aldenmoor on a Friday. No announcement. No advance word sent ahead. Alexander had suggested they could send notice. Give the village time to prepare, to arrange something formal. Cecilia had looked at him and said, no. He understood immediately. They arrived mid-morning. The carriage was different from anything Aldenmoor had seen. Not ostentatious, but unmistakably fine. The horses were better. The outriders were real. The Ashcroft crest no longer hidden, no longer rusted over, present, clean, and correct on the carriage door. The market road slowed first, then stopped. Cecilia stepped out and stood on the cobblestone she had walked every morning before dawn for 15 years. The same stones, completely different footing. She didn't look around triumphantly. She didn't need to. She simply stood there and let Aldenmoor look at her. Lord Harwick heard within the hour. She had not planned for him specifically. She hadn't needed to. Men like Harwick had political instincts, the way animals had survival instincts. He arrived at the town hall, where Alexander had called a brief assembly for formal announcement purposes. Before most of the village had finished gathering, he came in wearing his best coat. His expression was the careful rearrangement of a man calculating very quickly. Alexander stood at the front of the room, beside him Cecilia. Behind them both, the Ashcroft crest displayed, not the modest version, the full sovereign mark of Castanmere. Harwick's calculation visibly stalled. Alexander spoke briefly, clearly. The Ashcroft claim had been resolved, the Velmore challenge dismissed entirely. The sovereignty of Castanmere was restored under its rightful succession. The Ashcroft estate would be reopened and restored. Any outstanding matters of local jurisdiction, previously connected to the Ashcroft territory, would be reviewed accordingly. That last sentence was precise and deliberate. Outstanding matters of local jurisdiction. Every person in the room who had ever dealt questionably with the Ashcroft estate, the surrounding land rights, or the tenants on Ashcroft-adjacent properties understood exactly what it meant. Harwick's face had gone a specific shade of careful. After the formal address, people came forward. Not the powerful ones first, the ordinary ones. Farmers who had questions about land boundaries, tenants uncertain about their standing. People who had been navigating Harwick's sphere of influence for years without recourse. Cecilia spoke to them. Not Alexander. Cecilia, she knew these people. She had sold bread to their families. She knew which disputes were genuine and which were manufactured. She knew who had been pressed and who had pressed. Alexander watched her work the room and said nothing. He didn't need to intervene. She was better at this than he was, and they both knew it. Harwick approached eventually. He waited until the crowd had thinned. Of course he did. He was the kind of man who preferred witnesses when he was powerful and privacy when he wasn't. He addressed Alexander first. Naturally. "Lord Ashcroft," he began, "I want to extend my congratulations." "You addressed me at the harvest gathering," Cecilia said. Harwick stopped, turned to her with the reflexive surprise of a man who hadn't expected the furniture to speak. "I beg your pardon?" "The harvest gathering," she said pleasantly. "You announced my family's debt publicly. You threatened our home. You used my father's illness as a punchline in front of the village." She tilted her head slightly. "I want to make sure we're beginning this conversation in the right place." The room was not empty enough for this to be private. The people remaining heard every word. Harwick's expression moved through several calculations in quick succession. "Lady Ashcroft," he said carefully, pivoting to the title with the smoothness of long practice. "Any past misunderstanding—" "Wasn't a misunderstanding," she said. "You knew exactly what you were doing. So did everyone in that room." She paused. "The debt my family owed you was paid. In full, before I left Aldenmore." A beat. "The debt you owe this territory is considerably larger and considerably less resolved." She let that land. Then she smiled, not warmly. "I'd recommend consulting a solicitor," she said. "A trustworthy one this time." She turned back to the family nearest her, a farmer with a boundary dispute, and continued the conversation she'd been having before Harwick interrupted. Harwick stood for a moment in the particular stillness of a man who has just understood that the world has reorganized itself, and he has been relocated within it. Then he left. Helena Marsh, standing near the door in her expensive dress, watched him go. Then she looked at Cecilia. Cecilia met her eyes. Helena looked away first. Outside afterward, Thomas appeared from the edge of the crowd. He had been there the whole time, she realized, watching. He fell into step beside her. "That," he said, "was extremely satisfying." "Was it?" she said. "Don't pretend you don't know." He looked up at her. "You've been waiting to say that for months." She was quiet for a moment. "Years," she said honestly. Thomas grinned. She put her arm around his shoulders and kept walking. The gates opened on a Saturday, not ceremonially, not with a crowd gathered and speeches prepared. Alexander simply rode ahead that morning, and when Cecilia arrived with Thomas and Edmund in the carriage, the iron gates of the Ashcroft estate, rusted shut for 11 years, ivy-covered, the ones she had stood before every evening for as long as she could remember, were open, wide open. She stepped out of the carriage and stood in the gap between them. The estate beyond was overgrown but intact. Stone still sound, windows still whole, the bones of something magnificent underneath years of neglect. Waiting, the way things that are built properly always wait. Edmund appeared beside her. He looked at the open gates for a long moment. "You used to stop here," he said quietly. "Every evening on the way home." She looked at him. "Thomas told me." He smiled, the real one, the one the illness had taken from him for years and returned slowly these past months. "He said you'd stand here for exactly 1 minute, then come home and make supper." She looked back at the gates. All those evenings, all those minutes. "I didn't know why," she said. "I think you did," her father said gently. They spent the first week simply walking through it. Room by room, corridor by corridor. The estate was large in the way of things built across generations, not designed to impress, designed to last. Each room had a quality of accumulated life, of people who had mattered having existed there. Cecilia moved through it slowly and let it settle into her. She was not pretending, she was not performing, she was simply arriving in the place that had somehow been drawing her for years without her understanding why. Alexander found her one evening in the long gallery. Portraits on the walls, his family in descending order across the centuries. She was standing in front of the oldest one, a woman, painted severely, with steady eyes, and the expression of someone who had built something and knew its worth. "Who is she?" Cecilia asked. "The first sovereign lady of Castamere," he said. "Margaret Ashcroft. She held the territory alone for 9 years after her husband died." He paused. "The charter we found, she helped draft it." Cecilia looked at the portrait. The steady eyes looked back. "Good," she said. Edmund moved into the estate the following week. His room had south-facing windows and caught the afternoon light. The medicine came regularly now. The right medicine, properly sourced. Within a month he was walking the gardens in the morning, slow but present, the shake in his hands quieter than it had been in years. He sat with Alexander, sometimes in the evenings. She would pass the study door and hear them talking, not about legal matters or territory or anything of consequence, just talking, the way men talk when they've decided to trust each other. She didn't interrupt. She listened for a moment and kept walking, and felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight for so long she'd stopped noticing it. Thomas, predictably, was already planning. He wanted to study law. Had apparently decided this 3 weeks ago, and was presenting it now as established fact. He sat across from Cecilia at the kitchen table. He still preferred the kitchen table to the formal dining room, and so did she, and laid out his reasoning with the systematic thoroughness of someone who had been rehearsing the argument. She let him finish. Then, "I know," she said. He blinked. "You know? I've known for 2 years. I was waiting for you to say it." He opened his mouth, closed it. "The fees," he started. "Thomas," he stopped. She looked at him, her 12-year-old brother, who had held her hand under a table at a party where someone tried to humiliate them, who had squeezed once and said nothing because he already understood when silence was the right thing. "The fees," she said, "are handled." He looked at the table. She watched something move through him, relief, pride, the complicated emotion of accepting help from someone you love without it diminishing you. He looked up. "Thank you," he said, quietly, meaning it completely. She reached across and pushed his shoulder lightly. "Go plan something else." He grinned and went. That night, she found Alexander on the steps outside the main door. He was reading his father's letter. She had never asked about it. He had never mentioned it. She sat beside him on the step and looked at the dark valley below and said nothing. After a moment, he folded it. He knew it would be hard, Alexander said. He wrote that he was sorry for what he was leaving me, the fight, the years of it. He paused, but he said he believed I'd find someone worth doing it for. A long pause. He said he hoped I'd know her when I saw her. The valley was quiet. Stars out, cold, clean air. The gates open behind them. Did you? She said. No? He looked at her. At the bread stall, he said. When you told me my records were wrong, she laughed, surprised out of her. He smiled. Left it there? She looked back at the valley, at the stars, at the dark shape of Alden Moor below, where she had risen before dawn her whole life, and carried things alone and stood up in rooms where no one else would. She was still the same person. She just wasn't carrying it alone anymore. Alexander's hand found hers on the step. She didn't move it. They sat like that, in the quiet on the steps of something ancient and finally open, until the night deepened around them and the valley below disappeared into dark. She didn't go inside for a long time. She had spent 15 years rushing home. Tonight, she was already there. Thank you for listening. If you made it to the end of this story, you're exactly who Duke Tales was made for. Subscribe to the channel, ring that notification bell, and join a community that believes the best stories aren't about the most powerful people. They're about the ones who become powerful. See you next week.